Hello and welcome into this episode of the Brew Hoop podcast. We had to sound the alarms and we all woke up when the big trade went down, and then we just said, well, this can probably wait till Sunday, I guess, still. This is our version of, the emergency pod. Uh, Obviously we're all still hype over this Raptors win that just happened, and we'll also dive into some trade details later. But for now, I'll just say that Adam Paris, myself, co-managing editor of BrewHoop.com, is joined by Kyle Carr and Riley Feldman as usual. Thanks, guys, for fitting this into your schedule. You have to be hype after this Raptors win.
It might be the season-defining win. I know it's a little early, but come on. Is it too crazy to say that? I mean, to go in there, to finally have the game where Kawhi and Giannis both play, and to hang tough on the road and get the W, I think that's big. Plus all the tiebreaker scenarios down the road. So I think it is going to be a pretty big win in the context of the season.
And Kyle, I know you're tending to the hype train, but if you could just give us your thoughts and feedback on how you're feeling after this one.
It was slowing down a little, kind of lost a little bit of steam, but that's fine. We got more coal. Hype train is in full effect. Everything's going well, and the Bucks are the best team in the East, and you can go ahead and at me. I don't care.
Malcolm Brogdon came out of that timeout reading Kyle's piece about how he was useless and hit those 2 threes. No problem.
It's truly incredible. We're going to look back on really that maybe as the season defining moment where it really turned around for Malcolm Brogdon. I think he's probably over 50% now on the season from 3. It's just been absolutely ridiculous. But for anyone who didn't tune in or somehow didn't check Twitter or box score, which I think would be unbelievable at this point, the Bucks defeated the Raptors 104-99. Bucks had a pretty big lead late in the fourth quarter, and Raptors went on a good run to make it close. And then Bucks had it tied. And then down the stretch, it was Malcolm Brogdon coming to the rescue, hitting 2 huge threes off passes, one from Middleton. And he really was left wide open on the perimeter, and it showed that the Bucks offense really, which had looked a little stagnant in the fourth quarter, had stalled out, and then they were able to find some good looks late. Giannis had a monster dunk off an inbounds play, and then that sort of sealed the fate for the Raptors. So, Kyle, what were some of your just early impressions really quickly that you took away from this one?
This was a game of 2 heavyweight teams. It was a heavyweight battle. You had Toronto. They were coming out. Serge Ibaka once again just hitting pick and pop threes. Giannis it didn't seem like he was really getting into a rhythm until the third quarter. Big player. Everyone was hitting shots. Brogdon, Middleton, Brook Lopez, Sterling Brown had a few. Everyone was making key plays, and it was on both sides. I mean, you saw Kawhi defensively just smother Middleton near the end. Fred VanVleet was able to get a lot of layups. So it was, as a neutral, I think that's going to be a game that, if you didn't watch, you're going to kind of regret. This is what happens when you have the 2 best teams in the East playing each other. It's going to be close. And just when the Bucks thought they were going to maybe pull away and they're up 11 at one point, Toronto storms back in. It was a good game to watch, and I'm glad the Bucks won. But this is what happens with good teams playing each other. It's kind of going to be a nervy finish all the time.
Yeah, I thought it was a spectacular game to watch with lots of really intriguing chess battles sort of going on between the 2 coaches and the players on the court. Riley, what stuck out to you from this one?
I'd say the main thing for me, I mean, obviously, as Kyle kind of touched on, slow start on the offense, or kind of throughout the game, actually. I think that can be kind of attributed to the fact that they have Kawhi, they have Danny Green, they have Serge Ibaka, 3 guys who are pretty good defensively. But the one thing that I noted throughout was just how well Sterling Brown played tonight, and then the fact that he's also gotten minutes in lieu of Pat Connaughton and Dante. And I think that kind of just spotlights how much relative depth there is, at least for the bench guards, and the fact that, if one guy's kind of having a cold stretch, then you can swap in another guy and see if he can figure it out. And if he doesn't, then you got a third guy to swap it in there. So I think strong performances overall from the main guys that you would expect. Tough offensively, but you work it out, and that's kind of the nature of a high stakes game. But I think it was promising given the fact that they had not as much depth with the trade having happened. And yet you were still able to get through with Sterling Brown, who seems to be kind of finding his place. So that would be my big takeaway from tonight.
Yeah, the wing rotation is really fascinating to me. The fact that Pat Connaughton got only 5 minutes tonight. Sterling Brown basically led that parade of backup wings that you were talking about. He had 22 minutes. Also 7 rebounds on the night, which is really good number and spectacular. And of course, the Raptors play a little smaller, so it's a little easier for a guy like Brown to get rebounds. But that was really good nonetheless. A team high plus 12 for Sterling. Tony Snell was doing stuff, started to try to do a little bit too much stuff in the fourth quarter. I don't think I've ever seen Tony Snell feel himself, but I think he kind of was late in that game. I think that coast-to-coast finish that he had really put him in some sort of mindset, which is fine by me. I have plenty of Tony Snell stock, so that paid off there. Dante, of course, DNP coach's decision again tonight. The interesting thing, if you look at the stats, the Bucks at halftime were blazing from three. They had made 11 threes by halftime. We're shooting over 50%. That obviously comes down significantly in the second half. They end at 38.5%. So only make 4 3-pointers in the second half. 2 of those, of course, the big clutch ones from Brogdon late. Raptors make the same amount of 3-pointers, 15 for 44. It's actually pretty interesting how comparable a lot of the stats are across the board here. And that points to what you were talking about, Kyle, is that, when you get 2 teams like this together, it really ends up being a fascinating chess match there. You saw the Raptors go late a bunch to the pick and roll with Leonard and Lopez. And then, of course, they tried their gambit with their aggressive work on the inbounding, trying to force the Bucks not to be able to just waste time, and that sort of blew up in their face with Giannis going in there at the end. So, Kyle, I think that the best part to me about this game is that it showed that the Bucks were able to claw back and execute late against a team of this quality.
Yeah, it was definitely something that the Bucks were struggling with a lot. You can kind of see in the Knicks game a few weeks ago, the Suns. It just seemed like when the Bucks were in a tight situation, they kind of just froze up. It seemed like shots weren't able to fall. A lot of ISO balls, just nothing could go right. So to see that be on the other side, it's an encouraging development. I mean, Brogdon hitting 2 threes back to back certainly helps. But it's going to be interesting to see how much of their late game execution struggles were just a blip, or if it's a more worrying trend down the season. And this game was just an exception.
Aren't you guys heartened at all by the fact that last year, if we were needed a clutch basket, couple last seconds in the fourth quarter, and we go to the timeout and you have to have Kid or whoever the hell, some dude off, in the stands is drawing up the play. And then, tonight is a perfect example of how much a difference having Bud on the sideline as the guy who draws up the plays makes, in the fact that you're able to get that kind of, backdoor Giannis inbounds pass that Siakam isn't able to cover. And then there goes the dunk. And now the Raptors are forced to kind of switch it up. They have no timeout. So I think that right there is super critical, and is, that'll help out as the season goes on and then into the playoffs, with having the ability to at least have a shot at coming up with a pretty creative play to get you something at the end.
Yeah, especially when they were able to short circuit whatever he had for the first plan, and then Middleton had to get that timeout when he picked up his dribble at half court. So obviously incredibly heartening to see Bud be able to pull something out of his bag of tricks to get an easy bucket for the Bucks, who, if you look at just the strength of schedule, Bucks have had the 10th hardest schedule in the league so far. This is per Basketball Reference. Raptors are at the 25th hardest schedule so far. They said on the broadcast today, which I know some people did not like the Raptors broadcast, but there was some part of me that found it a little endearing if anyone was watching it. I don't know. The color commentator guy, going off the guy on CBS College Basketball that says onions. I forget his name, but that's kind of what he sounded like. Him randomly shouting Snickers really loudly into the mic. I don't know. I was kind of okay with that.
I was confused why this dude from Boston was on the broadcast. The entire evening, I kept on mocking him, which is horrible of me, but you can't help it with that dude's accent going on.
Yeah. It was really the accent that kind of made it a little more palatable to me.
Glad Fox Sports Wisconsin. So glad.
Yeah, that was probably the smart move. Well, obviously this is a huge win for the Bucks, but a lot bigger topic, especially among Bucks fandom, is the big trade that went down on Friday. It basically broke late Friday afternoon. John Henson and Matthew Dellavedova, RIP, have departed from the Milwaukee Bucks. And I'll just give a basic breakdown. Obviously, I'm sure many of you know it, but I'll just run through it here before I let you guys lay down your thoughts. So the logistics of the trade are that the Bucks get George Hill, who is under contract for $18 million this year, $18 million as well next year, but only $1 million of that is guaranteed. So basically the Bucks could jettison him before free agency, and they would only have to pay him, $1 million if they got rid of him. Bucks also get Jason Smith, a center from Washington. They get a 2021 second round pick, which is Cleveland's. Basically the Bucks swapped their 2021 second round picks with Cleveland. And then is part of the Jason Smith transaction. They also got Washington to remove the protections that were on the 2020 second round pick that they received in the Jody Meeks trade. So kind of nice to have two more assets in the cupboard for Milwaukee, even if they're not, of huge quality. And then basically the Wizards got Sam Decker out of that. Sorry, Sheboygan fans. And then the Wizards also got a second round pick from the Cavaliers. And then the Cavaliers, as I said before, basically swapped that 2021 second round pick with Milwaukee. And then they also get Matthew Dellavedova's triumphant return to the Mistake on the Lake and John Henson. So a very fascinating transaction to me. One, because it doesn't really involve any huge, amazing players, but there's a lot of huge implications for this team, both a little bit this season, I think far more for seasons going forward. So Riley, what was sort of your big takeaway when you heard that this trade went down?
You got to think it's a tacit signal from Horst and Budenholzer and the organization as a whole, at least in my opinion, that they're trying to push all the chips in for this year. And they were able to kind of signal that while only, yes, giving up the first rounder, we can kind of talk about that. That's risky, but to have improved a little bit of that second rounder where you're not totally hamstringing yourself. I mean, in 2020, the Wizards could be completely folded as an organization at that point. So who knows how valuable that'll be. But the fact that you were able to swap out two guys who weren't going to provide you anything this year, whether because of injury or they're just not good enough, in those two nigh untradeable contracts. I mean, this is the trade that emphasizes the fact that there's no such thing as an untradeable contract nor untradeable contracts in one deal. So to be able to get rid of that, get two guys who in theory are going to be able to produce and contribute and at least provide you a little bit more depth at positions that you need it. To me, I thought it was just saying, we're going all in. Now is the time to win, which I think is heartening for a lot of people. And I think that's probably the right place to be.
And Kyle, what about you?
It's weird, I guess. That's like the one thing to think of, because the last few years we've been saying they need to trade Deli and Henson's contract. They need to trade it, and it was just viewed as untradeable. No matter how available they were, it just couldn't happen. And the fact that it just out of the blue turns out is like, oh yeah, all you got to do is throw a first round pick, and somehow an injured Henson has more value than I ever expected. It's just kind of wild how that just turned around out of nowhere, but it's a good move on Horst's part. If this doesn't say we're going to try to be players come 2019 on July 1st, I don't know what does. And even if you don't get, keep your players like Bledsoe and Middleton and Brogdon and Lopez, you still have the potential to get other players now. It's not like you're kind of just limited to only your own guys. So I'm going to give Horst a round of applause for doing it because, yeah, there's that first round pick, which kind of stinks to give up. But, I mean, if you keep Giannis, that pick is going to be in the 20s. And with all the protections, it kind of does help the Bucks in case of worst case scenario. You could still have that lottery pick if it were to get to there.
Yeah, and for just to go through the complicated logistics of those pick protections that the Bucks 2021, basically they sent a 2021 first round pick to the Cavaliers. And to get into it, as many of you know, they also sent a first round pick to the Suns, which has very interesting protections on it. So basically the Suns would get it next draft if it is somehow within picks 4 through 16, which if the Bucks continue this way, likely won't be. The Suns would get it in 2020 if it's through the Bucks are finish anywhere from 8 to 30, which is basically most likely. So you can expect that pick basically to be conveyed in 2020 to the Phoenix Suns. For the Cavaliers pick, that 2021 pick goes to Cleveland if the Bucks finish anywhere from 15 to 30th. In 2022, anywhere from 11th to 30th. 2023, 11 to 24th, and then 9 to 30 in 2024. And then if it doesn't go over yet, it'll become 2 second round picks. So the interesting thing about that, of course, is the NBA Stepien rule, which dictates that if you cannot trade first round picks in 2 consecutive drafts. So basically, if we're working under the assumption that the pick is sent to Phoenix, the first round pick is sent to Phoenix in 2020, then that 2021 pick really won't convey until 2022, likely if the Bucks finish anywhere from 11 to 30. So there's a lot of really interesting wrinkles to this. So Riley, what do you think about all of the protections that they've placed on this pick? Is it too much of a gamble to have to give up an asset like this? What did you think about that?
I didn't mind it all that much, and the rationale is it's kind of like in years past where it's like we're going to win now, but the differentiating factor being that we have Giannis on the team. And as Kyle said earlier, one of the main facets of this trade is the fact that you're going to clear up so much cap space for yourself to either bring back the team or kind of swap things out, the supporting cast. So I don't mind the protection so much because you kind of looking at it like how the Houston Rockets have looked at first round picks, where it's like, okay, I mean, we're going to be so competitive that in theory, the picks are always going to be in the high 20s, so it really won't be as valuable to us as it would be under other circumstances, and we'll be able to kind of figure out enough on the margins and with trades and through cap minutia to be able to build up enough of a roster around the still growing talent that is Giannis to still compete. So I didn't mind it all that much. I know some people rightfully, value draft picks as a cheap way to add really valuable talent, but assuming that the Bucks continue to retain Giannis, and even if they don't, I mean, the team's going to be selling the tank at that point. That I'm not sure it'll really matter. So I don't mind it. Go for the win now this year, and then in theory, you clean or wipe the slate clean next year to kind of retool and see where you go from there.
What about you, Kyle? Do you think this was too high of a price to pay, or do you think it's worthwhile basically at this point for this Milwaukee team to be fine sort of sending out another first round pick, and so basically for a couple of years there they won't have a cheap guy under contract who could become an impact player?
I'm a little bit torn, but I think if to give up that first round pick stinks, but to have the cap flexibility of getting rid of your two worst contracts, I think it's worth the price. It's going to be interesting. Like I said, what they do this upcoming summer is really going to define whether it was a good trade or not. Because if you give yourself this flexibility, but then you pretty much just set the money on fire by giving someone a bad contract, then, that's not going to help. But the main point of doing this is to win now so you can convince Giannis that this team can win now. And really, this team they can win now. They can beat Toronto in a 7-game series. They can beat Philly in a 7-game. They can beat all these other teams in the East. So it shows that this team has the ability to compete for a championship. And if that convinces Giannis to sign the the Supermax extension, then it's worth it. It's completely worth it in the end. So yeah, it's a little bit higher than I would like, but at the same time, if you can get rid of untradeable contracts, and what we saw with kind of Freed kind of earlier really set that market. So it was going to have to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I've certainly been on the boat. That was one of the reasons I actually liked the Bud hiring most, is that you wouldn't have to go sort of through a growing period that you might have with a fresh coach. And when I think this period is so important to show Giannis that you're committed to winning and trying to convince him and ensure that he will stick around. So that was one of the reasons I liked the Bud hiring. And so going in like this makes sense, especially when you think about where those picks will likely be. You hope they are. It's good they're trying to get a couple more second rounders, though, especially with the Bucks having a good amount of success in the second round so far. It's good to try and retool the war chest a little bit that way. So you guys are talking a lot about this being like a win move for this season, a win now season. So I thought of this trade a lot in terms of this trade a lot more as a future focused move than anything on the court this season. Like I guess for me, I'm dubious whether George Hill will make that big of an impact. Jason Smith, I think, is just kind of whatever personally. So I'm curious about your rationale. Do you think this makes the team appreciably better? Like, do you think this is something that will actually have a really strong impact on them on the court this season, Riley?
I think that's a good question. I would say it weirdly probably revolves more around what Jason Smith brings. And it really depends on Thon, because Thon has had, like every Thon season that's ever happened so far, he's had his positive moments and then he's had his negative moments, where Jason Smith, who I had no idea, he is an 11-year vet. That totally came out of nowhere for me. The fact that he's kind of like Brook Lopez almost, where he's slowly transforming his offensive game to include the 3-point shot. I think if he can come in and be a little bit more reliable on both ends to anchor the backup units, that has a value all its own in the regular season. And then Hill, I agree with you. I mean, I'm real wishy-washy on whether or not 2016, 2017 Utah Jazz Hill is the real guy, or if the Hill of last season between Sacramento and Cleveland, who, I mean, he didn't look washed, but he looked, not as great. If that's the Hill that we're getting, which is probably more likely than not, then he might not nearly be as valuable, but then you only have the guaranteed 1 year. So I kind of look at it as Jason Smith probably is an X factor, and then both guys are playing in what are proverbially contract years, so they'll have their own incentive to kind of go out and perform to the best of their ability. So you're right that they probably won't be like game changing. We went from a 55 win to a 60 win team by bringing in these guys, obviously, but just a little bit more depth. Again, like I said earlier, swapping out two guys who were definitely not going to give you anything for two guys who might give you something. I think that has a value all its own.
Yeah, that's for sure. And George Hill obviously has a good amount of experience in the playoffs. I think that's something that'll be really interesting to watch with this team, considering so many of these guys, especially all of their core players, basically haven't advanced super far in the playoffs. And of course, we don't have to rehash the Eric Bledsoe performance so far in his games against the Celtics. Kyle, this was something I was thinking about, was one of the cool things about this trade getting done so quickly is that basically now these salaries of Jason Smith and George Hill can be aggregated in a trade come February. So basically they could be added on into a trade to try and make sure that the money matches between teams. So I think that's obviously a smart move to keep the flexibility open for this team. And it's something I'm not necessarily going to rule out, because I guess I wasn't thinking as much about, I don't know who the Bucks could really sign for a free agent to get that much help. Brook Lopez is clearly the kind of guy that they probably want to target. They do have like the mid-level exception that they might be able to use on him if they're interested in trying to retain him at a higher salary. But, I guess I was thinking about this. I don't know how many teams actually are looking to get off money for next season. So do you think that's an avenue the Bucks could explore, is trying to use this George Hill contract as bait? Because it is a sweet one with only $1 million guaranteed this next year. So you can basically get $18 million worth of dead salary and get it off your books quickly.
I want to say that, but I think George Hill will be sticking around. I think he brings like a veteran presence that's Bud's going to want, especially in the backcourt. Would I be surprised if they ended up trading it? No, but I just don't see it happening as much. It would be nice if there was a team that was able to take on that salary and give Milwaukee a lot, like even more cap space than they have created for themselves, but I just don't see it happening. I think Hill's going to be part of that rotation, is kind of going to be competing with Dante and Pat Connaughton and Sterling Brown. It just depends on who the hot guy is going to get the playing time. I didn't realize Jason Smith was an actual player, what he did, or I couldn't line up. It brought it to me, but it is what it is. I am kind of worried with that trade, though, what that means for someone like Christian Wood, or even, more Giannis at center lineups.
Yeah, and I don't know. The Giannis at center lineups have been interesting, and like I think we've talked about this in other podcasts of ours. So I don't know. Jason Smith will be an interesting piece, obviously a backup piece. Really, I mean, if when it matters, I doubt he'll even see the court that much in the playoffs. He'd be a guy, though, that when you look at it, it's like, okay, do we trust Thon in there for 5 minutes? More to your point, Riley, that you were stating earlier. Do we trust Thon in the playoffs for 5 minutes, or do we trust Jason Smith more in the playoffs for 5 minutes? And so maybe that's sort of the calculus that they were thinking about up to this point. You talked about, Riley, you guys had both sort of mentioned this as like a agreement that we're kind of in the win now mode. Do you think it was also a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that maybe this is the core that they want to keep going forward, as they want to try and retain all of these guys for next season? Or do you think maybe they're just trying to free up money to see if they can add some other impact player?
I mean, how can we really know, right?
Right.
I think for me, it probably leans more towards, I'm not sure if it's about bringing everybody back. I definitely think it's about opening up the flexibility to have both options, but I really wouldn't be surprised, given the fact that, the Bucks worked so hard to get that deal done. Like we were saying, right before the aggregation deadline, would seem to suggest that they have their eyes on, something else out there, and whether or not it actually comes to fruition, who knows? But I'm not sure if it's necessarily a signal that this is the go-to group. I think it's more so signal we're going to open everything up, and if another guy who's valuable, Bradley Beal, if he becomes available, and if they're infatuated with him, then I think this opens up the option to go grab him. I don't think it guarantees that everybody that is a part of the core now comes back. I think it's more so let's give ourselves as much option, as much flexibility as possible. We've seen what we did bringing in guys this past offseason, how much of a success that has been. We figure out throughout the season who's, part of the core heading forward, and then you can kind of work from there. So plus it's like a little bit of extra insurance in case Chris Middleton gets, the kind of deal that if they don't want to go for this max deal for him, and if he finds them somewhere else, then you give yourself a little bit of breathing space there as well.
Yeah, it certainly makes the discussion about next summer a lot cleaner. And Danny LaRue wrote on The Athletic, and he knows the cap far better than me, just talked about how the Bucks could somehow find a way to keep all these guys, Brogdon, Bledsoe, Middleton, and Lopez, and still stay below the luxury tax. So they require a little bit of cap smithing there. Yeah, I guess for me it was, I don't know if maybe it was some lingering thought in my head about how old Bucks teams, they might have a little bit of success and they'd have these guys that they bring in and they're like, oh, these are our guys. Hey, this success, we need to make sure that we retool and keep these guys around. And then that got them a little bit into the situation that they're kind of in now, that they were in, where they had these players who were signed to contracts that they weren't really able to play up to them. They were kind of hamstrung, and then they basically had to use an asset to get rid of them. So I mean, obviously the players that we're talking about are of significantly higher quality, I would say, than the players like John Henson and Delly that Milwaukee has brought in the past. But I guess that philosophy had still sort of stuck in my head and taken root and made me think, well, maybe they're just trying to make sure that it's easier so they can keep all these guys, when I don't necessarily know if that's the right move. So I like that they're able to potentially aggregate this stuff. And if they spot someone maybe at the trade deadline that they would have control over them, then I guess that would make more sense to me if they're trying to acquire some guy than if they're trying to acquire some guy via free agency to fit in before they sign guys using bird rights. Since I kind of doubt that Milwaukee would be able to get that marquee free agent. I feel like there's not a whole, obviously they have the city and market and all that kind of working against them. And I don't know how many players they have that are kind of working in behind the scenes in that, shadow texting of the NBA, USA basketball type connections. I know Chris Middleton is kind of on the roster, but I don't know if they're like doing that sort of active recruiting type stuff.
Who's like the second best Greek player right now in the league? Whoever he is, let's go get that guy. That's the connection. We'll just make an all Greek team with the occasional Australian to keep our international flavor. No, Adam, kind of just on your larger point, the one thing that I would say about the fear about the win now mindset kind of seeping its way in is the fact that we have Giannis, obviously, and it's not so much, for me, it's not so much win now so that we can prove to Giannis that we're serious about winning, so it'll stick around. I mean, obviously that has a component to it as well. But I mean, you have one of the league's, whatever, top 5 players, and he's only 24. So in theory, he's going to be a top 5 player for the next 4 or 5 years at a minimum. So the difference between win now versus win now the past is the fact that you have this top flight talent, and you obviously have to worry you can't continue to make stupid deals, but if you're able to play it right, you can kind of get things on the margins, and you have a lot more margin for error, for lack of a better phrase, to kind of work around.
Yeah, I think that's a good point and a good way to look at it. So, well, I don't know. Do you guys have any other closing thoughts on this trade? I feel like we kind of went through a good chunk of what is going to impact the team on the court and going forward. So I don't know. Any other closing thoughts? We're not doing grades as much as fun as that would be, I'm sure, to give grades on this.
No, I'm just kidding. No,
See you later.
No, the only thing I would say, it'll be interesting seeing how Hill's arrival affects the minute allocation between, primarily the guards, because I'm not sure if you could say he's a traditional point guard per se, but he's probably a little bit more traditional than like Malcolm as a point guard or whoever else we were throwing in there for substitute lineup. So I saw some people saying like he might start. I doubt that very much so, but What does it mean? Do we get more Bledsoe Brogdon minutes, which I think of like two-man lineups who have more than 200 minutes, they have the worst net rating of all the different combinations. So those two, for whatever reason, don't seem to click nearly as well as other combinations do. So if they have more minutes, what does that mean for the team? Is Hill going to start taking up starting minutes? Like, I think that'll just be kind of interesting seeing how Bud works that around.
Yeah, and obviously we saw like we said, we saw the wing rotation flip a little bit on its head tonight. So maybe it'll be a situation where George Hill is just fitting in, and he's the kind of guy who has to take spot minutes as they come, because it's tough to take Brogdon off the court right now. And obviously Bud has been leaning pretty heavily on him to close out some of these quarters and go through small stints where it's just Brogdon and the bench, which is generally not what I would think of as the lineup you would really want to do, but they haven't been hemorrhaging points too poorly so far. So I don't know, maybe you throw George Hill into those lineups too, and then they're able to improve a little bit, to your point, Riley. Kyle, any other sort of closing thoughts on this trade?
I think I still want to give more applause to John Horst. I mean, he came in with a bunch of bad salaries and a lot of question marks surrounding the roster, and it seems like he's able to slowly but surely make the moves that's needed to help the team in the long term, whether it is keeping Giannis or giving yourself cap space for, impending situations. And kind of like what you two were saying, when you have a top flight talent, it's easier to give that core around him new contracts, because at the same time you have that top flight. While before, when the Bucks were offering these contracts, it was just because they were the best player, which is kind of sad at times. But I think I'm okay with the trade. I like it. I like the situation. And also, Nick Kalithis is the second best Greek player right now, currently averaging about 19 points in FIBA European qualifiers. So he currently plays at Panathinaikos over in Greece.
Sounds like the next Luka to me.
The point guard. So
I think he already had a stint in the NBA, wasn't he?
Yeah, I remember him. Yeah, he was with Memphis. Yeah.
At some point.
Yeah, okay. Maybe not him. We'll find like the third or fourth best Greek.
Because I'm not saying Costa Koufis, because no.
If you Google him, the main picture that comes up genuinely looks the most like a creative player I've ever seen. It's got like a bald head and it looks like have like a Sharpied on beard.
No.
It's that's a really good look for him. We'll have to post that in the comments. Continuing our trend of just
has ties to the mafia, so I'm not.
Oh gosh. All right. Well, I feel this was just going to be a quick hitter. Obviously, when something this big goes down, we got to talk about it. And I know John Horst didn't technically sign John Henson and Delly to those contracts. That was his predecessor. But he seems to have, at least to this point, taken on his incredible John Hammond's incredible ability to also get out of bad contracts. And he was in the brain trust then, so at least to this point, he's doing a decent job of it. So hopefully he won't have to keep continuing to do that weird cycle. But right now it seems like the Bucks have made a big trade, and we'll see how this affects the on-court stuff going forward. And of course, it'll have a lot more ramifications for next summer. So make sure to always check our stuff out on BrewHoop. You can follow us at BrewHoop on Twitter. Kyle's excellent thumbs are behind that. The hype train will be full steam ahead. We have a lot more games ahead, and we'll probably come back with a full-timed podcast sometime around Christmas. Maybe we'll have some holiday special stuff. Of course, you already heard our holiday movies that you were supposed to watch in the last podcast. So make sure to check all of our stuff out on BrewHoop. We just added a new writer, Brian Sampson, who was in charge of the Bucks Film Room Twitter account. Excellent stuff there. He'll have some really good stuff for all of us. And of course, Kyle and Riley are always pumping out great content as well. So make sure to review us on iTunes, subscribe to us on iTunes, go to brewhoop.com. The Bucks content you want is there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.